Okay, can you all see the screen and hear me well?
Yes.
Okay,
At least I
perfect.
can, yes.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present. My presentation will be on self-perception of aging and their associations with cognitive, physical, and mental health and well-being. Before starting, I just want to say that I would prefer if you ask questions at the end so I can see you in the face while I'm answering. But if you have any prompting questions, you could maybe write them in the chat box and I can then answer them at the end. So I will start by providing some background knowledge on the topic of subjective aging, and I will introduce the theoretical framework of awareness of age-related change. And then in terms of the body of the presentation, I will present 4 studies. The first 2 studies will focus on awareness of age-related change in relation to health outcomes in people without dementia. Whereas in the last 2 studies, I will talk about the subjective experience of aging in people living with dementia. So starting from the background, with the term subjective aging, I mean an umbrella term encompassing several concepts, all trying to understand the way in which individuals experience aging or the beliefs that they have about aging. Examples of concepts falling under this umbrella term are attitudes towards own aging, subjective age, self-perceptions of aging, and awareness of age-related change. So starting from attitudes towards aging, these capture individuals' perceptions and evaluations of the changes taking place in their lives as they age. Attitudes towards own aging start to be developed early in childhood, and they are influenced by individuals' social, cultural, and historical context. And attitudes towards aging become more and more important and self-relevant as people grow older. Much of the evidence available on the concept of attitudes towards own aging has been collected with the Lawton's attitudes towards own aging scale. And to provide some examples of items used in this scale, we have as I get older, I'm less useful, or I'm as happy now as I was when I was younger. And for each item, participants are asked whether they agree or disagree. And based on participants' answers, their level of attitudes towards on aging can lie on a continuum, having negative attitudes towards on aging on one hand and positive attitudes toward on aging on the other hand. Most people have at least some negative attitudes toward on aging. And when people have negative attitudes toward aging, they tend to perceive losses as being an inevitable aspect of old age. And because of this, they tend to perceive engagement in health-related behaviors as being pointless. So individuals who have negative attitudes toward on aging, they tend to show less engagement in health-related behaviors and poorer levels of cognitive, physical, and mental health over time. Moving on the concept of subjective age. Subjective age captures the age individuals feel they are, which can differ from their chronological age. Most of the literature on subjective age has been collected by using a one-item question, asking individuals to report the age they feel they are most of the time. And here again, individuals' answers can lie on a continuum, reporting older subjective age on one hand and a younger subjective age on the other hand. Now, in this case, most people report feeling younger than their age. And stereotype internalization and dissociation model provides an explanation of why this happened. In line with this theory, it may be that many people report a younger subjective age because they attempt to dissociate themselves from their peers and the negative age-related stereotypes that are attached to their peers and therefore to other people. There is, however, a minority of individuals who report either feeling older than their age or feeling their own chronological age. And these individuals typically tend to show less engagement in health-related behaviors and poorer levels of cognitive, physical, and mental health in adulthood and older age. And as a third concept of subjective aging, we have self-perceptions of aging. Now, research in this regard has focused on with qualitative studies and mainly interviews or daily diaries asking individuals to report either the events that made them feel old or the changes that made them feel old. And in research in this domain suggests that there are a variety of events that increase the salience of one's age. For instance, individuals can report birthdays, retirement, or becoming the carer for a family member as events that arise in them awareness of their age. But very importantly, individuals report the experience of both positive and negative changes while growing older. So examples of positive changes are having more time to spend with friends, having more knowledge and increased life experience to pass on next generations. Whereas examples of negative changes are a decrease in memory ability, the loss of life partners, or the insurgence of chronic conditions and poor physical health. So now the objective changes that individuals experience while growing older and their interpretation of such changes are believed to give rise to a more recently introduced subjective aging concept, which is awareness of age-related change. Awareness of age-related change captures a person's state of awareness that his or her behavior, level of performance, or way of experiencing life has changed as a consequence of having grown older. So this concept of awareness of age-related change, or AARC, has been introduced in 2010 as an attempt of overcoming the limitations of previous existing subjective age concept. And I want to mention two main limitations. The first one is that most of the literature on subjective aging has so far categorized individuals as having either positive or negative experience aging. However, as we have seen with a self-perception of aging, it may be that individuals, while growing older, experience both positive and negative changes that coexist. A second main limitation of existing research on a subjective age is that many studies assess individuals' experiences of aging in a global way, but it may well be that individuals report different experiences of aging in relation to different domains of their lives. For instance, their interpersonal relations may be different from their cognitive experiences. The awareness of age-related change concept instead makes it possible to assess for the first time individuals' perceptions of both positive and negative age-related changes, and these are respectively called gains and losses. Moreover, gains and losses can occur in 5 domains of individuals' lives that are interpersonal relations, social cognitive and social emotional functioning, lifestyle and engagement, cognitive functioning, and physical health. So it may be that these specific conceptual features of awareness of age-related change help us to better understand individuals' experiences of aging in relation to their levels of health. To assess awareness of age-related change, a questionnaire has been made available in several versions of different length, including a 10-item version and a 50-item version of the questionnaire. What I've used in my research is the 10-item version of the questionnaire for practical reasons. But I've also used an additional 10-item subscale assessing awareness of age-related change specifically in the cognitive domain. So to provide some examples of items, each item starts with the same stem, which is with my increasing age, I realize that. And individuals are asked to answer on a 5-point Likert scale whether they agree or disagree with the items. So an example of item assessing losses in the physical domain is I have less energy, whereas an example of item assessing gains in the lifestyle domain is I have more freedom to live my days the way I want. An example of item assessing gains in the cognitive domain is I've become wiser, whereas an example of item assessing losses in the cognitive domain is I am more forgetful. So when Professors Diehl and Professors Wahl introduced the awareness of age-related change concept, they put it in a broader conceptual framework, linking awareness of age-related change to distal and proximal antecedents, two variables that may be involved in the process of awareness of age-related change, and to health outcomes. In terms of distal antecedents of awareness of age-related change, they suggest health-related, socio-demographic, and psychological variables. Now, looking at the research that is available on the topic, we can see that those individuals who perceive higher levels of losses have been experiencing poorer levels of mental and physical health, whereas those individuals who report lower levels of gains have been experiencing poor mental health. It seems that socio-demographic variables also play a role on individuals' levels of awareness of age-related change. However, their role is quite small and it may change among different countries. Whereas in terms of psychological variables, it seems that quite a wide range of psychological factors play a role on awareness of age-related change. For instance, those individuals who are more aware of losses tend also to show higher levels of neuroticism. They have poor control beliefs. They are less likely to show a mindful attitude and to perceive social support. They are more likely to ruminate and to experience cognitive interference. Now, moving on the proximal antecedents of awareness of age-related change, research has also shown that when individuals perceive higher levels of losses, they also have more negative attitudes toward aging. They tend to experience more functional limitations, poorer sleep, and higher levels of pain. Now, moving on the mental process of awareness of age-related change, this is a part of the model that has quite a lot of importance because it is believed that awareness of age-related change is a part of individual self-knowledge, and because of this, it may play a big role on whether individuals are motivated to engage in health-related or adaptive behaviors. And literature on this topic tells us that when individuals experience higher levels of losses, they are less likely to engage in self-regulatory and health-related behaviors, and they tend to see their future as being more limited. Awareness of age-related losses are also associated with a variety of health outcomes. When individuals report higher levels of losses, they tend to experience poorer levels of mental and physical health over time, whereas when individuals report lower levels of gains, they tend to experience poorer mental health over time. So in this brief overview, we have seen that there seem to be quite many variables that impact on individuals' perceptions of changes, and mainly health-related variables, the experience of limitations in individuals' lives, but also quite a wide range of psychological variables. The way in which individuals perceive their aging seem to play a role in their behaviors and in their levels of health over time. However, there are two main limitations gaps in the awareness of age-related change literature. The first gap is that cognition has not been explored in relation to awareness of age-related change yet. Moreover, even though the awareness of age-related change concept makes it possible for the first time to assess the coexistence of gains and losses, so far perceptions of gains and losses have been explored separately in relation to individuals' levels of health. So with the first two studies that I'm going to present, I attempt to provide an initial an explanation for these two gaps in the literature. So the first study focused on associations of objective cognitive performance.
Serena,
Sì, yes,
me.
yeah.
Could you please click on the nascondi
Okay,
little,
yeah, okay,
yeah.
okay.
Okay, I didn't want to interrupt before, sorry. But,
okay, can you see the screen? Yeah, yes. Okay, perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So starting from the first study, this focused on associations of objective cognitive performance with awareness of age-related gains and losses in cognition. So the rationale behind this study is that I was interested in exploring whether awareness of age-related change can be a useful concept in the area of dementia prevention to identify those individuals with poor cognition, and that because of this may be a higher risk of cognitive decline. And as a consequence, these individuals are those who would benefit the most from some sort of cognitive interventions aiming either to delay or prevent pathological cognitive decline. So existing evidence on self-perceptions of cognition and aging suggests that there may be an association between individuals' perceptions of age-related changes and objective levels of cognition. Indeed, there is some evidence showing an association between the subjective experience of cognitive decline and higher likelihood of neurodegeneration. There's also some evidence supporting an association between more negative attitudes towards aging and an older subjective age with poor cognition and higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. However, on the other side, there's also some evidence linking negative self-perception of cognition, negative attitudes towards aging, and an older subjective age to poor mood. So it's not quite clear right now whether when individuals perceive cognitive decline and when individuals have negative perceptions of aging, these are informative of their objective levels of health, of cognitive health, or whether they are just reflecting poor mental health and poor mood. So because of the unique concept, framework of the awareness of age-related change concept, which makes it possible to assess both perceived gains and perceived losses in cognition, it may make it possible to better understand how self-perceptions are associated with levels of cognitive health. So the first aim of this study was to test whether higher levels of gains and lower levels of losses are associated with better scores on objective cognitive tasks. A second aim was to explore whether these associations vary among individuals in middle age, early old age, and advanced old age. And then a third aim was to explore whether levels of gains and losses are associated with a wide range of psychological variables, including depression, anxiety, attitudes towards aging, subjective age, and self-rated health. So in terms of the methodology of the study, I used secondary data collected as part of the PROTECT study, collected in 2019. In PROTECT, participants are UK residents, English speakers, they are aged 50 years or over, and they had no clinical diagnosis of dementia at recruitment in 2015. For the specific purpose of this study, I also excluded those participants who may have had a mild cognitive impairment. So the sample size comprised 6,056 participants whose mean age was 66 years. The majority of participants were women and almost all of them were white. In terms of measures used, starting from measures assessing self-perceptions of cognition and aging, I used a 10-item version of the Awareness of Age-Related Change questionnaire, assessing awareness in the cognitive domain only. To assess attitudes towards on aging, I used Lawton's attitudes towards on aging scale. To assess subjective age, I used a 1-item question. And to assess self-rated health, I also used a 1-item question. To assess cognitive functioning, I used the Protect Cognitive Test Battery, which is a computerized online battery which is self-administered by the participant, and it includes 4 cognitive tasks that are grammatical reasoning, digit span, paired associate learning, and self-ordered search. I also assessed the number of times participants played a brain training game. In terms of indicators of mental health, I assess symptoms of depression over the past 2 weeks with the patient health questionnaire and symptoms of anxiety over the past 2 weeks with the generalized anxiety disorder scale. And finally, demographic variables were also assessed. To address the first 2 study aims, I conducted path analysis models. In each model, gains and losses were placed as predictors and scores on the 4 cognitive tasks as the outcomes. And the models also controlled for demographic variables, health-related variables, and frequency of engagement in cognitive training. And I tested the same model in the overall study sample, but also in the 3 subsamples of individuals in middle age, early old age, and advanced old age. To address the third study aim, I conducted multiple regressions with depression, anxiety, attitudes towards on aging, subjective age, and self-rated health as predictors of gains and losses. So moving on the results, we found that as expected, higher levels of losses in cognition were associated with poorer scores on objective cognitive tasks. But as you can see, the associations are either small or negligible, and the strongest association in size is the one between higher levels of losses in cognition and poorer scores on the grammatical reasoning task. Unexpectedly, we also found that higher levels of perceived gains in cognition were associated with poor scores on cognitive tasks. Moving on the second study aim, which was about exploring these associations across different age groups, we found that individuals in middle age and early old age show similar associations. So in both these groups, higher levels of perceived losses and higher levels of perceived gains were associated with poor scores on objective cognitive tasks, whereas individuals in advanced old age showed a different pattern of associations. In this group, the unexpected association between higher levels of gains and poor cognition disappeared, whereas the association between higher levels of losses and poorer scores on the grammatical reasoning task increased. And moving on the third study aim, as expected, we found that lower levels of perceived gains and higher levels of perceived losses were associated with more depressive and anxiety symptoms, more negative attitudes toward on aging, an older subjective age, and poorer self-rated health. So the results of this study suggests that higher levels of perceived gains may not characterize individuals with better cognitive performance. And as I said before, this finding was unexpected, so we thought about several possible interpretations for why this happened. A first possible interpretation is that when individuals, those individuals who have poor cognitive ability may make less accurate appraisal of their cognitive abilities. A second possible explanation is that those individuals who have poor cognitive performance are more likely, are more prone to think about their gains as a way of, as a sort of coping strategy to reestablish a positive emotional state. A third possible explanation is that individuals with poor cognitive performance are perceiving at the same time high levels of gains and high levels of losses. And this possible interpretation is further explored in the next study that I'm going to present. But we also have to acknowledge as a last possible interpretation that the items that we use to assess perceived gains capture social cognition and wisdom, so they may have not been suitable for comparison with performance on objective cognitive tasks. Findings of this study also suggest that when individuals have high levels of losses, they may be experiencing some levels of cognitive decline across several cognitive domains, especially in verbal reasoning. However, the size of the associations was small. As we found that the unexpected association between higher levels of gains and poor cognition became smaller, disappeared in older age, and the association between higher levels of losses and poor cognition instead became stronger in older age, it may be that older individuals are more accurate in reporting their cognitive decline. But as the association between higher levels of losses and poor cognition was small, awareness of age-related change may provide little information about individuals' levels of cognition. We again thought about several possible explanations for why the associations were small. So a first explanation could have been the cross-sectional nature of our study design. However, longitudinal work that I have in preparation, where I explored whether 20-year changes in cognition predict levels of losses, suggest that associations stay small. So a second possible interpretation for the small associations, which is also supported by the results of this study, is that perceived losses in cognition capture other psychological variables alongside perceived limitations in cognition. So among strengths and limitations of this study, the main strength is the fact that we assessed for the first time whether the coexistence of perceived gains and losses in how the coexistence of perceived gains and losses in cognition is associated with objective cognitive tasks. And the large sample size is also a strength of this study, as it made it possible to reliably conduct subgroup analysis. Among main limitations of this study, I've already mentioned the cross-sectional nature of the study, but also the composition of the sample may be a limitation, as participants' mean age was 65 years old, so they may have not been old enough to experience significant levels of cognitive decline. Despite its limitations, this study suggests that levels of losses may be influenced both by individuals' objective cognitive abilities and by their interpretation of the cognitive changes that they experience. The way in which individuals interpret their cognitive changes may be shaped by their beliefs about age-related changes in cognition and by their current emotional state. So it may be that when individuals report high levels of losses, they may benefit the most from interventions promoting psychological health rather than cognitive trainings. So moving on the second study, in this study I explored health differences among people with varying profiles of awareness of positive and negative age-related changes. This study started from the reasoning that there's a great variability in the objective levels of cognitive, physical, and mental health that individuals experience in middle and older age. And it may be that this variability in objective levels of health is reflected in individuals' perceptions of aging. So I expected that there are different profiles of individuals reporting different combinations of gains and losses while aging. So the first aim of this study was to identify profiles of individuals having different degrees of gains and losses in a large sample of middle-aged and older adults. And then the second aim of this study was to examine how the identified profiles of individuals having different degrees of gains and losses relate to indicators of mental, physical, and cognitive functioning. So in terms of this study sample, I used the same study sample as the one used in the previous study. There are small differences in the number of participants, as in these studies I found relevant to include participants who were deemed to have a mild cognitive impairment, as these individuals may be the one experiencing the poorest levels of health. In terms of measures used, there's also much overlap with the previous study, with the exception that in this study I used an item version of the awareness of age-related change questionnaire assessing awareness of age-related change across all 5 domains of individuals' lives, so not only in the cognitive domain. And as a further indicator of physical health, I also used Lawton's instrumental activities of daily living scale. So to explore my first study aim, which was to identify how many classes of individuals with different profiles of gains or losses exist at population level, I used a latent profile analysis, and I identified the classes based on individuals' answers on the 10 items assessing awareness of age-related change. I found that the model with best fit was a 4-class model. Participants in the first class reported many gains and few losses, and they represented 45% of the study sample. Participants in class 2 reported moderate gains and few losses, and they represented 24% of the study sample. Participants in class 3 reported many gains and moderate losses, and they represented a further 24% of the sample. And participants in class 4 reported many gains and many losses, and represented only 7% of the study sample. So we can see here that all participants in all classes report either many or moderate levels of gains, and what changes among classes are the perceived levels of losses that individuals report. Now, to address the second study aim, which was to explore whether there are differences in levels of mental, physical, and cognitive health across the identified classes, I used chi-square tests and ANCOVA. I found that there are significant differences among classes in terms of health indicators, and more specifically, the class reporting many gains and few losses had the highest levels of mental, physical, and cognitive health, and this class was followed by the classes reporting moderate gains and few losses, many gains and moderate losses, and many gains and many losses. So as we found that the class reporting many gains and few losses had better health than the class experiencing moderate gains and few losses, levels of gains seem to be important to enhance individuals' health. However, we also found that the class reporting both high levels of gains and high levels of losses showed the worst health status. So this suggests that higher levels of gains may be related to better health only when accompanied by low levels of losses. Whereas when individuals experience high levels of losses, they may experience poor health irrespectively of their reports of levels of gains. So this study again shares the same strengths and limitations of study 1. So moving on the conclusions for this second study, as we found that there are 4 profiles of individuals characterized by varying degrees of gains and losses, we can say that at population level there's great variability in the coexistence of perceived gains and perceived losses. Most frequently, individuals report experiencing many gains and few losses, but there's also a small proportion of individuals who experience both high levels of gains and high levels of losses. Importantly, as we found that the meaning of high levels of gains changes depending on whether individuals are experiencing high levels of losses or low levels of losses. This highlights how much it is important to assess the coexistence of perceived gains and perceived losses when linking self-perceptions to health outcomes. So as the first 2 studies focus on the awareness of age-related change concept, whereas the last 2 studies focus on subjective aging more in general, I provided here concluding remarks for studies 1 and 2. A first concluding remark is that higher levels of perceived losses may be an indicator of poorer cognitive, physical, and mental health. Lewis' stereotype embodiment theory may explain why individuals reporting higher levels of losses are experiencing poorer cognitive and physical health. So this theory suggests that assumes that individuals internalize negative stereotypes about older individuals in early age, and then as they grow older, these stereotypes become more and more self-relevant, and they play a role on individuals' levels of health through 3 pathways that are the psychological, the behavioral, and the physiological pathway. So in line with Lewis' theory, those individuals who report high levels of losses, they also tend to have poorer levels of self-efficacy and a more negative view of the future. And because of this, these individuals are less likely to engage in healthy and adaptive behaviors, which we know that are important for maintenance of cognitive and physical health. Moreover, those individuals who experience high levels of losses, they also tend to report higher levels of stress, which is again a risk factor for cardiovascular events and as a consequence, poor cognitive and physical health. In terms of the association, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, there was like a
Nico, okay.
Hear you and see the presentation.
So in terms of the association between mental health and higher levels of losses, hopelessness theory of depression may explain the association between higher levels of losses and more likelihood of depression. Hopelessness theory of depression says that when individuals experience negative events and when they also interpret these events in a negative way, they tend to feel hopeless, which is a risk factor for depression and also a symptom of depression. In line with this theory, when individuals experience high levels of negative changes while aging, and when they interpret these changes as being a consequence of aging, which is something out of their control, individuals may feel hopeless and as a consequence experience high levels of depression. The association between higher levels of losses and high levels of anxiety may instead be explained by theory management theory. And theory management theory assumes that when individuals become aware of their age and of their mortality, they tend to experience high levels of awareness. And awareness of age-related change are the attribution of changes to increased age, and as a consequence, they may increase awareness of mortality and anxiety. A second concluding remark for these first two studies is that as the awareness of age-related change questionnaire may be useful to identify those individuals who are experiencing poor cognitive, physical, and mental health, these individuals would benefit the most from some sort of interventions. Now, when individuals are experiencing debilitating health conditions, reporting higher levels, attributing such changes as being a consequence of older age may be a realistic understanding of the changes that these individuals are experiencing while aging. And then these individuals, as a consequence, may benefit from psychological interventions, promoting passive coping strategies, and ego integrity. However, when individuals' levels of health can potentially be increased, interpreting changes as being a consequence of aging, which is something out of one's control, may be maladaptive and result in inactivity. These individuals may therefore benefit more from interventions that promote positive views of aging and engagement in behaviors that help to counteract the experience of losses. So now we move on the last two studies of the presentation that will focus more on subjective aging in people with dementia. And as you have seen in the first two studies, most of the research on the topic of subjective aging has focused on relatively healthy older adults and individuals without cognitive decline, because research sees the potential in individuals' perception of aging as a way of promoting a better health in older age. However, I wondered whether positive subjective aging may also be beneficial for those individuals who are living with chronic health conditions such as dementia. And specifically in this third study, I explored whether subjective aging helps people to live well with dementia. So when I talk about living well with dementia, I mean the best achievable health state that encompasses all dimensions of physical, mental, and social well-being. And living well with dementia can be assessed by using questionnaires of quality of life, satisfaction with life, and psychological well-being. Research so far has shown that the psychological characteristics and psychological health of people living with dementia are associated with their perceptions of living well. So it may well be that the way in which individuals perceive their aging is also related to their capability to live well with dementia. And in this regard, one study has reported that when individuals experience more negative attitudes towards on aging, these are associated with poor quality of life in people living with dementia. So building on this first study, I explored in people with dementia whether attitudes towards on aging and subjective age are associated with indicators of living well and with psychological health. To conduct this study, I used cross-sectional data that has been collected as part of the baseline assessment of the IDEAL cohort study. At baseline, people included in the IDEAL study had a mild to moderate dementia. They are residents in Great Britain, and they were able to provide informed consent. The sample comprised 1,541 people with dementia, whose mean age was 76 years, and a little bit about half of participants had Alzheimer's disease. In terms of measures used to assess subjective aging, I used Lawton's attitudes toward on aging scale, and then a one-item question assessing subjective age. To assess living well, I used the quality of life Alzheimer's disease scale, the satisfaction with life scale, and the World Health Organization 5-item well-being index. As an indicator of psychological health, I used the 10-item geriatric depression scale, whereas as indicator of physical health, I used the Charlson Comorbidity Index. And finally, personal characteristics were also collected. In terms of data-analytical design, I simply conducted univariate linear regressions to analyze the associations of attitudes towards on aging and subjective age with quality of life, satisfaction with life, and psychological well-being. Whereas I use logistic regressions to analyze the associations of attitudes towards on aging and subjective age with depression. So in terms of results, I found that people with dementia reported neither a negative nor a positive attitudes towards on aging, but their attitudes lay on the middle. But only 36% of people with dementia reported feeling younger than their age. Importantly, when people reported more positive attitudes toward on aging and a younger subjective age, they also reported better quality of life, better satisfaction with life, better psychological well-being, and less likelihood of depression. So results of this study suggest that positive subjective aging may act as a psychological resource that can help people with dementia to live well, but also to maintain psychological health. These findings can again be interpreted with Lewis stereotype embodiment theory, as those individuals who internalize a more positive experiences, more positive perceptions of aging early in early age, they may experience better psychological health in older age. What's important to note about this study is the association between subjective aging and levels of depression, as the proportion of people living with dementia experiencing depression is way higher than the general population of older adults. Another important finding is that subjective age in this sample was reported only by 36 people living with dementia, compared to 70% of older individuals in the general population who generally report a younger felt age. Now, this shouldn't be interpreted as something necessarily negative, as reporting feeling their age or older than their age for people who living with dementia may also be a reasonable understanding of their situation and condition. In terms of main strengths of this study, we have the large sample size, considering that it was a sample of people living with dementia, including several diagnosis subtypes. Another important strength is that we collected the views of people with dementia themselves, so people with dementia answered to questionnaires. Among main limitations of the study, we have the cross-sectional nature of the analysis, but also the fact that we used a 5-item scale to assess attitudes toward on aging did not make it possible to explore people with dementia's experiences of aging across different domains of their lives. Despite these limitations, this study suggests that more positive subjective aging can help people with dementia to live well with the condition. However, it can be hard for people with dementia to live well with the condition and to be positive about aging because all of the negative changes that they experience. So a first challenge for us is to find ways of optimizing subjective aging in people living with dementia. And possible ways of achieving so are by promoting more positive views of aging at societal level and decreasing ageism across individuals of all ages. A second challenge is also try to find new ways of counteracting the effects of negative age-related stereotypes in people living with dementia. So possible means to achieve this goal are focusing on the retained abilities and on the achievable goals in people living with dementia. And now moving on the fourth study, we have seen in the previous study that being more positive about aging seems to be beneficial for people living with dementia. However, it can be hard for people with dementia to be positive. So in this last study, I was interested to compare levels of attitudes toward on aging in people between people living with and without dementia. And because people with dementia experience an extensive cognitive decline, this experience of poor cognition may confirm the negative stereotypes that are salient in our society and that depict older people as being cognitively inferior to younger individuals. So because of this, it may be that people with dementia have more negative attitudes toward on aging. And two studies support this idea. However, these two studies only found small differences in levels of attitudes towards on aging between people living with and without dementia, and did not control for health-related covariates, which are quite important, especially in a sample of people living with dementia. Moreover, there's also a third study that even though it focused on people with suspected dementia, it found results that are in contrast to these two previous studies. So to raise as an attempt to clarify previous evidence and to overcome some of their limitations, this last study aimed to investigate in two cohorts whether people with dementia have more negative attitudes towards on aging than people without dementia. This study also aimed to explore whether levels of attitudes toward on aging differ among dementia subtypes, and also to explore whether levels of attitudes towards on aging are associated with cognition and cognitive subdomains. So in terms of methodology and samples, as a sample of participants who were cognitively healthy, I use participants from the project study, and have already described this sample in the first two studies that I've presented. Whereas in terms of a sample of participants with dementia, I use people from the ideal study, and again, I've already described this sample in the third study that I presented. So in terms of data-analytical design, I obviously had to combine the two data sets and to harmonize some of the measures used. And then in terms of analysis, I simply did linear regressions and analysis of variance. So looking at the results, we found that in line with existing evidence, people with dementia do report slightly more negative attitudes towards on aging than people without dementia. However, this difference is very, very small, and it loses significance after controlling for depression and self-rated health. What was interesting is that amongst dementia subtypes, most negative attitudes toward on aging were reported by people with Parkinson's disease dementia and dementia with Lewy bodies, and levels are particularly low in these two groups. In terms of the association between attitudes towards on aging and cognition and cognitive subtypes, we found that after adjusting for covariates, only better visual spatial ability predicted more positive attitudes towards on aging. And because of this finding, we did some postdoc analysis where we explored whether people who have more negative attitudes towards on aging also have poor visual acuity, and results support this reasoning. So it may be that those individuals with poor visual ability have more negative attitudes towards on aging because of poor visual acuity. So to summarize the findings of this study, results suggest that there's no difference in levels of attitudes toward on aging in people living with and without dementia. And the slightly more negative attitudes toward on aging reported by people with dementia in previous studies may be due to people with dementia experiencing higher levels of depression and poorer levels of health. We found that people with Parkinson's disease, dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies report most negative attitudes towards on aging. So these individuals may lack of a potentially important psychological resource while living with dementia. And the more negative levels of attitudes towards on aging among these dementia subtypes may be due to people with Parkinson's disease, dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies experiencing movement disorders and visual spatial abnormalities. And finally, it seems that in people living with dementia, more extensive cognitive impairment is not related to negative attitudes towards on aging. And this was unexpected, as literature on cognitively healthy older adults suggests and consistently suggests an association between more negative attitudes towards on aging and poorer cognition. So in terms of strengths and limitations of this study, the main strength is that we attempted to overcome some of the limitations of previous studies by controlling for health-related covariates and by exploring the association of attitudes towards on aging with cognition and dementia subtypes. And the main limitation of this study is that we had to combine participants that came from different cohorts and therefore had different socio-demographic characteristics and have been recruited in different ways. So this is a big acknowledgement that we have to make. And here I just reported some concluding remarks for the last two studies. So in these two studies, we found that the attitudes towards on aging may not differ between people living with and without dementia, and that having more positive subjective aging may help people with dementia to live better with the condition. So both these results may be due to views on aging being developed early in life and staying rather stable throughout individuals' lives. So finding ways of promoting more positive views of aging early in life may help individuals to grow older, equipped with a psychological resource that may help to live better even in the occurrence of conditions such as dementia. And this is why it's very important to promote positive views on aging. And several strategies in this regard have been suggested, and those of you who are interested in reading more could read Lewy's paper. And I'm also glad to say that some of these strategies are currently being implemented. So I wanted just to conclude with a slide with my future directions. I've now collected longitudinal data on awareness of age-related change, and I'm in the process of exploring the direction of the associations between awareness of age-related change and health indicators, as well as exploring possible mediators and the link between awareness of age-related change, genetic risk of dementia, and cognitive performance. So if you're interested in these topics, I'm currently working on the paper, so if you would like to collaborate, please contact me. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and thank you to my funders. So I've also included some references in case the presentation will be made available, and I'm happy to discuss and answer questions. So
okay, it will be made available. We are recording it, so thank you very much, Serena.
Okay, I want just to stop sharing so I can see you.
Perfect. Yeah, that little symbol there.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
Perfect.
so now it's time for questions. Let's see. Remember that you can just switch on your microphone if you have questions to make. Mm-hmm. I have some.
Okay. It was quite a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of work. Yeah. And I have to acknowledge that it is not my field of research and knowledge, but I found it an interesting concept. But I have some questions, no? Because what struck me most is that during the whole talk, I felt like the direction of the effects between physical and cognitive outcomes and the scores in these let's say questionnaires for this concept were kind of interchangeable. No, you said right at the end that you will explore the direction of these associated mediators. No, because this is what I was thinking. Many times it felt like you would be saying that like the Levi's stereotype embodiment theory that you were presenting. No, that if you feel more positive and you have more positive let's say attitudes towards your aging, then your physical outcomes seem to be better. But I was wondering why not the other way, right? I mean, I understand and I kind of share the idea. It's like we would all think and we all relate, you know, have family or relatives or that that we will see, you know, that these attitudes can change health. But I was wondering to what extent your data, your studies can actually support that strong conclusion in that direction, and how you will explore it from now on.
Yeah, so so as you have seen, my studies are more cross-sectional, so I can answer based on my knowledge of existing literature on the topic. So it seems that there may be bidirectional associations between individuals' perception of aging and objective levels of health. So far, most of the literature has focused on individuals' perceptions as a predictor of future levels of health, and it shows that actually individuals' perceptions are quite a strong predictor of future levels of health in the long term. Evidence exploring whether individuals' levels of health predict their perceptions is more limited. It seems that individuals' attitudes and therefore stereotypes about aging, they seem to be developed very early in life, and they seem not to change. So irrespectively of what individuals experience, they hardly change.
At 40 years old, then you will always feel old.
It's more what is interesting is that when people have negative attitudes towards aging, they tend to have this general negative idea about aging. But if you ask them to answer about their aging, they may be positive about it, because there may be a discrepancy between the way they are experiencing their own aging, but how they are still perceiving older people in general.
Like older people in a nursing home that would say, I am surrounded by old people, and it's like
exactly. So there's quite a lot of subjectivity. what is interesting is that, and there are a few studies on this regard, but those intervention studies that have been conducted so far show that when you combine behavioral intervention, let's say promoting physical activity, with an intervention and changing views on aging, self-efficacy, and so on, these seem to have quite a stronger impact on individuals' health-related behaviors. So there is some potential for promoting better health in older age. However, we are still at the beginning of research, so these interventions need to be implemented with longer follow-ups. And also personally, I'm not that sure about the association with cognition, because from all my studies, I can see that the association is really small, and it seems that it's more. There are so many factors that influence individuals' perceptions of the cognitive changes that they are experiencing, including their beliefs, their knowledge about cognition, their mood, and so on. So I don't know in that regard, but in terms of levels of cognitive, of physical and mental health, there seems to be some scope.
Good. Thank you. And I was going to ask also, you talked about visual acuity, like individuals with poorer self-reported visual acuity also have more negative attitudes towards own aging. And I was thinking about, what about hearing status? Because we know that in aging,
it may well be
to decline, and then there is they struggle more with the speech perception, and then that kind of also isolates them more from the rest of the.
Yeah, it may well be, and I will explore it. I have quite a broad data set, so
I can have data about the
so only for people without a dementia.
Okay.
But I will explore. So my point there was more that it may be that this small association that we find between cognition and more negative attitudes, it's actually due to other factors. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, if you have the data, it's just a matter of putting it in the model.
Yeah. And relating to your previous question, I have now longitudinal data on awareness of age-related change. So the idea is just to conduct cross-lagged panel models and see which direction is the strongest one. So we will see. But it's quite an interesting field, because it's quite difficult to interpret because of all the variety of factors. So.
Yeah, it's a lot of variables to take into account, and how you operationalize those, and that is complicated. I have a last question, which would be related to, but I understand that because you took the data from these big data sets, I understand that you did not design what cognitive tasks you would give to the. And I was considering, like, if you thought about if you could, the working memory tasks. Working memory is one of the factors in at least as far as I know, in cognition that declines more with aging. Even in healthy aging individuals, working memory decline is one of the factors underlying many of the perceived cognitive problems, and even speech comprehension, for example. And you have the digit span, I think.
Yes.
Those are more related to storage, like storage items in working memory. But as far as I know, manipulation tasks, like manipulating information, like for example, an NBAC task, like I have this number, I have to store it in memory, but then I have to keep on monitoring the numbers that are presented and then make a comparison. Those type of tasks, like manipulation of information, seem to decline a lot more. And I was considering if the project thought about incorporating more sensitive working memory tasks than the digit span.
And I mean, I took data from the project study, so I couldn't design that. But I know that colleagues are collecting data about other types of memory. And I also explored working memory in relation to awareness of age-related change. But in this case, I explored a 20-year change in working memory as predictor of awareness of age-related change. And results are still small or negligible. And this time I had a way smaller sample size. So it may be that these effects are very, very small, and I found some significant results in the studies I presented because I had a very, very large sample size.
Could be. Okay, thank you. There's the one question by Francisco. He says, what do you think about applying this type of self-assessment in people with Parkinson's disease?
Well, well, this is something that has been suggested to me recently. So I've been approached by an Italian group. Actually, they are interested in using the awareness of age-related change measure with people living with dementia to kind of understand their experiences as a sort of way of initiating work with them. And we are moving towards that. But it's not going to take some time because we first want to validate the measure in a healthy sample of older adults. And then the problem is that this measure has been designed for people without cognitive impairment. So there has to be some adjustment in order for people with dementia to understand the measures. I think there's so limited evidence. I think there are 4 or 5 studies exploring perception of aging in people living with dementia, and the only validated questionnaire is the Attitudes Towards on Aging questionnaire. So there's so much little evidence, but it will take time to further understand how people with dementia perceive aging. But I found quite interesting that people with Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies had poor attitudes, because research conducted also in our group found that people with these 2 dementia subtypes score more poorly also in other psychological outcomes. So it's definitely a group that will deserve further exploration. It's just difficult to collect data for these specific dementia subtypes.
More questions? Maybe Francisco? He says thank you.
Welcome.
Last question, just out of curiosity, do you have any item in these kind of questionnaires that relates to the goals in life? Because I remember a talk slightly long, maybe it was long ago, pre-COVID times, obviously. And in the neuropsychology group, they were having this project that they were talking about the relationship between cognitive reserve and this idea of having a goal in your life, no? That, I don't know, elderly people who survived the war but managed to move on because of the kids, and then they have grandchildren, and they have a scope, no, in life. And apparently that related really well with cognitive ability and cognitive reserve. So I was thinking if you have any item related to that, or what do you think of this concept?
So in the 10-item version I used, no, I would have to go through the 50-item version, and there's also was an initial 100-item version, and I think it would be something actually interesting to explore in the future. And well, people while answering the awareness of age-related change questionnaire were also asked to report their thoughts in relation to the questionnaire. So I also analyzed qualitative data, and this came out quite a lot. So many participants, it could have been either a positive or a negative goal, or just being busy, for instance, being busy with grandchildren or busy caring for someone else. And they said that they didn't really had that much time to worry about age-related changes. So it seems that when people are busy, first they feel useful, and then they experience some gaze, and second, they do not have that much time to ruminate over the losses and have that level of anxiety.
Yeah. That's
good.
David Partres is the scientist who's working in this project.
Okay.
It I think it's a large-scale project, but I don't remember exactly. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Serena for being here with us. The talk is recorded. I will stop it now so we can watch it again whenever we